Sharika Thiranagama's doctoral and postdoctoral work has focused on the effects of civil war on life in Sri Lanka, and her work is primarily focused on two groups, Sri Lankan Tamils and the much less mentioned Sri Lankan Muslims. And to me, that's one of the most interesting things about her work, the way that she talks about a more complicated situation in Sri Lanka than is often presented in the media, of which I'm a member. And her work focuses on the effects of civil war in Sri Lanka, particularly on the ideas of home, kinship, and self. And she's also done a lot of other interesting work on Sri Lankan railways, the BBC, and also is currently working on a more regional approach, and her work will be specifically focusing on the southern state of Kerala. Today, her talk is focusing on a subject that I find particularly interesting, and it's titled All Tigers Are Tamil, but Not All Tamils Are Tigers, Anthropology and the Culturalization of Politics. Sharika Thiranagama is an assistant professor of anthropology on the faculty of the New School and is visiting assistant professor at Stanford University. And it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce someone whose work has meant so much to my own work. And without further ado, Sharika.
Thank you so much, Sugi. And so tell me if you can't hear me or if I mumble too much. But I'll try to keep the latter to a minimum, and I'll speak up louder if you can't hear me. But as Sugi said, most of my work has been actually on the Sri Lankan civil war, which, as many of you may know, ended very brutally in May 2009 with the defeat of the LTTE by the Sri Lankan state. Now the end and everything that occurred around it is sort of mired in controversy, and I'm not going to talk about that, though I can answer questions on it if anyone wants to. But today I'm going to focus on a very specific segment of my work, which is actually on militancy and on the LTTE, which was arguably one of the most successful guerrilla groups in the world. Hence the title. They're also most famously known as the Tamil Tigers. Now, so let me just begin at least with two anecdotes from August when I was just in Jaffna. And so the Grama Sevaka, which is like the local municipal officer in charge of a very large ward in Jaffna town, said to me, and he was quite pro-LTTE, quite critical of the Sri Lankan state. He said, well, this is a very different piece from the LTTE's piece. And then he said, when the LTTE told people to do things, they did things, they obeyed them, always. And then he was thinking about his time all day, arguing with refugees about whether they had supplies or not. And he said to me, well, you see, that was power. He said, now this is government. And then he said, but actually this state is also learning that it likes power too. When he was talking about the army presence. And earlier on that week, I'd been having a conversation with a middle-aged Dalit man and asking him about what the LTT's relationship to the bitter caste disputes in his area had been, because they famously recruited from all different castes, and they said that they were very much against caste. And he said, well, look, he said, the thing is the LTTE wanted to keep power. So they would come to all groups and say, we are actually with you, we're for you. But in the end, they always went with the Vellanas because they wanted power. And then he said to me, they only changed things within their movement. They didn't care about us outside. And now the reason I bring up these two anecdotes is because they're very familiar to me from my earlier work in Sri Lanka. And it's these two facets of the LTTE that I want to bring out today and sort of pose them counter to a lot of the accounts of popular support that many scholars of the LTTE have suggested, and show and talk about how those who lived under them understood them, even those in support of them, as a political and state-like organization. And also criticize the way in which many commentators have understood internal structures in the LTTE as if they were representative of Tamil society, rather than examining the ritualized and purified boundaries of the LTTE, the statement. They only changed things inside. They didn't care about us outside. And I want to talk to you about this inside-outside distinction which informed Tamil life in Sri Lanka. So let me just begin by framing, in a sense, what I'm arguing against. So actually, while the history of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka is extremely well documented, there's much, much less work done on the experiences of people living through the war. for practical reasons, often because it's been dangerous. But what there has been in the last 10, 15 years is an enormous spurt of interest in the LTT. Most work on Sri Lankan Tamils is either about the Tamil diaspora in Toronto or about the LTT state, the LTT martyrology, the LTT cadre, and especially about the LTT's female cadre in particular. So, I mean, before I get into that, I just want to sort of give, for those of you who don't know, just like a brief picture of the LTT, in a sense, and then from my own fieldwork. So the LTT really emerged as an object of study for two things. One, because of its very high-profile suicide bombings, like the killing of the Rajiv Gandhi, for example. And two, when it more or less set up a quasi-state in the 1990s in North and East. So the LTT had a judiciary, aside from its navy and army and shipping industry and so on. It also had a judiciary, a taxation system, a police system. It ran a bus service. It had some sort of civilian administration too. But its primary features were always a pyramidal structure focused on their leader, Prabhaharan, an excessively disciplined and highly militarized cadre, the use of suicide bombings, and every cadre wore a cyanide capsule, signaling their willingness to die for their leader, an extensive intelligence network, and a heavy prioritization of eliminating traitors within the Tamil community. And elsewhere, I've written a lot about their practice of eliminating traitors, so I'm not going to talk about it too much today. But basically, the thing to understand is that the LTT recruited heavily, both voluntarily and also forcibly. And large-scale conscription meant that most Tamil families, all Tamil families, had a connection to or a member in the LTT. So it wasn't just that there were cadres, there were also your brother, your sister, your son, your cousin, as well as the uniformed men and women patrolling the area. And at the same time, intelligence cadres also infiltrated and mobilized people to inform on other people. So when I did fieldwork, the thing that people would say all the time is there's no nambike, there's no trust among Tamils anymore. So you really saw a situation where the fear of other Tamils increased as the LTT expanded. And this is one of the real difficulties when you study the LTT, this kind of intimacy of the LTT within Tamil life and also the coercion. And how do you balance this thing where you say, how do you understand the intimacy of the ties that bind the LTT and Tamils together, the guilt, the love, the hatred, the fear, as well as not collapse Tamils into the LTT. This is what I mean. How do you understand that all tigers are Tamil, but not all Tamils are tigers? And to a certain extent, this hasn't happened in the research on the LTT, because most of the research in LTT areas was always with their permission. And this really reflected in the work that people did. They were not so critical. I mean, there's a whole spate of studies which just basically all started off saying that they wanted to humanize those that those in the West saw as demonic terrorists. So you get all this work like Margaret Travik, and that's the impulse. And then these studies are also about how these supposedly unsophisticated guerrillas in the jungle actually turn out to be these very savvy, technologically proficient, English-speaking. There's always this amazement. Oh, look, these people, they built this structure, they have this. And a lot of the studies never get past that amazement that there's actually a structure. And so they, in most sense, and also because the Sri Lankan state was incredibly repressive, which seemed to lend weight to the idea that Tamils could never be safe under the state. So most of the studies that focused on the LTT state more or less focused on this sort of savvy structure and sort of erased the coercive side of it, the traitor prisons that were all across the north, the extortion, the machinery for child recruitment, and the siphoning off of rehabilitation funds for military purposes. And that's a more general, I mean, I'm pitching it very generally. But there's two particular problems that I want to focus on that I want to counter. And one of them has to do with the LTT female cadre, because essentially it's a part of a wider literature on women and nationalism. So it's now accepted that women are not automatically nurturing and nice people. So, and that was very much challenged by the enormous amounts of women involved in nationalist struggles and also in armed struggles within the wider feminist literature in the 80s and the 90s. And there was increasing interest in the subjective experience of these female fighters, and also propelled by kind of media interest, which did think of women as nurturing, so presented these women who were involved in various struggles as somehow objects of interest because of their unnatural qualities. Now, throughout this literature, the major feature has been LTT female cadre. You can look through any of this, and there's always a mention of the LTT women, because they were nearly 30 to 40% of the fighting force. And so there's two positions really within the literature. One says that the LTT women are agents, that they're breaking with the shackles of traditional Tamil society, that the LTT initiated social emancipation. Peter Sharika calls this martial feminism as opposed to Western feminism. And he calls it the indigenous idea of good Tamil feminism. And then there's another set of scholars who see them as victims, which point to the oppressive idea of chastity, katbu, which united the LTT idea of its women as virgin warriors, the centrality of the leader, Prabhakaran, the male leadership, and not least the LTT's regulation of the cadres. So in some senses, I am more with the second camp, but I do think, along with other writers, that there was ambivalent empowerment for LTT cadres, male and female, within the context of Tamil communities that were very heavily gender and caste structured and heavily gerontocratic. But I think one of the major problems has been that the focus on the subjective experience of those involved in the movements has led to this deep blindness about the relationship of the organization to larger society, of the relationship of LTT female cadres to other women, other militants, or just to civilian women themselves. And that, the point is not just to understand LTT female cadre, but actually the deep paradox, how a radically politicized society in which large numbers of young men and women went to fight can also be a society where these militants who profess to abhor gender and caste structures not only continued but actively re-entrenched these structures when they left the movement. That is the paradox, in fact, is that how these two things can coexist. And that's one of the things that I really want to talk about. And I want to link that in some senses to the other popular position which I want to counter is the implicit equation of the LTT as an extraction and explainable by Tamil culture. So there's been some studies which study ancient Tamil poetry to find the martial values of Tamils and link it to the LTT. On a different track, Margaret Travick, in her exploration of LTT cadres in eastern Sri Lanka, writes, "The radical aspects of tiger culture are explicable within the larger frame of Tamil and other Dravidian culture." End quote. And she explains devotion to Prabhakaran within the Bhakti traditions and in relation to three forms of Tamil love: pasam, attachment; pattu, devotion; and anbu, selfless love. And she says, among the tigers, anbu for the people, pattu for Prabhakaran, and the breaking of ties of pasam for kin and friends are all fully in accord with wider Tamil cultural values. And this is also presaged by Peter Sharka's argument that the LTT female fighters espouse a martial indigenous Tamil feminism, which is opposed to the Western feminism of Tamil women who opposed the LTT militarization of women. So the problem is really that authors like Travick or Sharka or Michael Roberts not only objectify Tamil culture as a known entity, they do it at a time of intense contestation and fluidity in the midst of war, and in the context of a highly organized organization who's not just a reflective but a shaper of society around it, and for the benefit of helping Western audiences understand these Tamils better, the LTT actually, in fact, better. So here culture is less kind of modes of disputation and more pre-given and highly textual context used to explain LTT self-pronouncements. And that's really what I want to say is really completely inappropriate to understand the LTT. So instead, I want to argue that to understand the LTT, we have to understand its origin in a much larger phenomenon of popular militancy in the 1980s, and its perfection of the tropes of separation, purification, and love of the movement and the leader above all, which it, more than any other militant movement, elevated as its supreme binding principle for young men and women. And I've written quite a bit about younger people joining the LTT at the period of forced conscription. But today I want to talk about the older generation who joined militancy as a radical experience rather than as a normative one to think about transformation a little bit clearly. So I don't want to race too much, but I'll try and get through a lot of this material quickly. So essentially, most standard accounts of the conflict say, okay, in the 1970s, lots of small militant groups began forming in the Jaffna Peninsula in response to discrimination by the state and the failure of Tamil parliamentary parties to end this. And there are 5 groups that dominated: TELO, LTTE, PLOT, EPRLF, and EROS. I mean, I could tell you what the acronyms meant, but it's an alphabet soup. P normally stands for people, L stands for liberation, T stands for Tamil, E stands for Ulam. You can just mix them up and figure out the acronyms. But all 5 of these big 5 were formed before the 1983 anti-Tamil riots. But it's undoubtedly, as most accounts point out, those riots which transformed them from small groups numbering like 10, 15, 20 to massive groups. And certainly after 1983, Indian central government provide arms and training for all these groups in South India, and soon there were multiple militant groups too, though some of them were really endlessly tiny and fracturing all the time. But the big 5 continued to dominate and until the LTTE became supreme over the others in 1986. Now, so the reason I want to focus in on this movement is that most accounts of this period of militancy is all about the rise of the LTTE. And they take this period as a prima facie, this is how the LTTE began, and it went up. And I just want to give you some statistics for you to understand why this is such a much more complicated period than that's been accounted. So, and because I did most of my research with people from the other militant groups, and for a very good reason, because they were the majority of that generation. So the late journalist Sivaram compiled some statistics. There's very few statistics on this, but I'm going to give you some of the ones he did. So he estimated that around, in this period, in the peak years of recruitment in 1984 and 85, there were around 44,800 militarily deployable youth in the north and east. And all groups had 2 sets of cadres. They had cadres trained in India and local cadres in Sri Lanka. And those local cadres could then be moved into the Indian units. So PLOT, and also most of them, except for the LTTE, had political wings. The LTTE had a political wing very late. It also had a women's wing very late compared to the other movements. So if I give you some figures, PLOT, the largest, had 6,000 in India, 12,000 local. TELO had 4,000 in India, 2,000 in Sri Lanka. EPRLF had more than 7,000 in its military wing. The LTTE had in the mid-1980s less than 3,000 full-time trained cadres. And only in 1987 did it number 4,000. And I'm not even counting the thousands that PLOT and EPRLF mobilized in the villages for consciousness raising. So the point I'm trying to make here is that 80 to 90% of those who joined did not join the LTTE. And so this means that the mobilization of Tamil youth into militancy as a protest against the 1983 riots and discrimination cannot be explained as so clearly by the LTTE itself. And they also can't be pushed into the account of the rise of the LTTE. And this is something that really nobody talks about at all. And the other important thing to know about this generation, they were all aged around the age between 16 to 29, which means that there's an enormous concentration within that age range, but a visibility within Tamil life, which is quite extraordinary if you think of it as a subjective experience in the 1980s. So to sort of illustrate this, I'm going to take 3 stories of joining. So first I'm going to take 2 stories, one of Sakti and EPRLF, female cadre, and Kuhamuthi, a former TELO cadre. And they were both from very large families from Tamil-speaking Vellala, that's upper caste, backgrounds. And they were part of a new generation in Sri Lanka, the Swabhasha generation. They were the ones who were first educated, like in the south, in Tamil and Sinhala, not in English, and in a country with a disproportionately large Anglophone elite. And they came, and this is the era of insurrection. There's insurrection in the south, followed later by insurrection in the north, and it's the same generation. It's a generation of people who were part of the expansion of education to all, but had no jobs to go to. had enormously different expectations from their parents about what they were going to do, nonetheless. And many of them went into militant movements in the south and the north. Now, Sakti and Kuvamuti both, like many young Tamils, were completely disillusioned with the TULF, the parliamentary party, which they saw as upper caste, the old elites of Jaffna Tamil society, and they moved into the militant groups instead. And it's the thing is that when you really look at the militant groups, the sites of many of these discussions were in schools. Militant groups appeared in the secret languages of the young, the conversations that fell silent when those in authority, parents and teachers, appeared. And they proclaimed their freedom from caste boundaries, and some, like EPLF, actively recruited Dalit castes. Though because all the movements recruited from friends, family and village connections, they ended up being caste-like movements. So Plot was always thought of as a high caste movement. EPLF was always thought of as a low caste movement, and the LTTE was always thought of as a fishing caste movement because they had a core in the northern fishing village, Velvetitura and the Karayar caste. But the reason that it was so significant that they professed their boundary freedom from caste is because throughout the 1960s there had been intense caste conflicts in the Jaffna Peninsula over temple entry, and the parliamentary parties constantly sidestepped those issues as divisive, and they sort of re-entrenched a sort of high caste attitude to these things. And really, young unmarried men and women that I interviewed saw joining the militant movements as a way to free themselves from the household and marriage obligations. So in Jaffna, in the north, marriage is the key life cycle relationship, and dowry is the prime way in which capital is accumulated and inherited. And this weighed on young men who had to work to get dowry for their sisters, and women who were the processes by which households were reconstituted constantly. I mean, sons are not meant to inherit land in Jaffna, they're meant to marry land. You see, this is the way and women pass the land on. And given that the household is the central institution in Jaffna, it means that women wield a great deal of power in Jaffna. It's not to say that they don't, but they only wield it within a script of being a chaste Jaffna wife. And the women who moved into militancy directly challenged that mode of gendered power. They challenged the gerontocratic basis of the household. And instead, so for the people who joined, the young men and women who joined the militant movements and the groups, it wasn't just singular majoritarianism that was to be opposed. It was also Tamil society itself that was posed as problems that had to be fixed as well, particularly caste, gender, and generation issues. And then for the unmarried and economically juniors, the movements offer this feeling of horizontal kinship based on mutuality, togetherness, ideological commitment, and ones that they saw were completely different from the caste and generationally structured family and household they were running away from, with these vertical relations of land and marriage. So even if sibling relationships in the family were about dependency and obligation, the militant groups, like a lot of groups worldwide, instituted sibling relations as a valorized mode of egalitarian relations. So they all called each other elder brother Anna, or younger brother Thambi, elder sister Akka, and younger sister Tangachi. And the movement celebrated the power of youth, junior and powerless in the household, to initiate and make change for the whole of society. And what's really significant for looking at these movements is not just a list of sociological factors that predispose people to join movements, because that doesn't explain actually why people join movements and stay in them. I mean, for example, all kinds of people joined the militant movements. They said they were Maoists, they said they were Marxists, they said they were nationalists, Christians went, Hindus went, those who had experienced violence went, those who didn't experience violence went, all kinds of people went. And when they joined, they took new names on. And even after leaving the movement, the majority of the people I interviewed, even though they left them, still knew each other mainly by their movement names, and that's what they used in their everyday life. They didn't call themselves by the names they were born with, and their children also knew them only by their movement names. And you know, people would say things like, oh, you should go and talk to Tello Sundar, or EPRLF Vijay, and so on and so forth. And so when people talk about joining militant movement, they talk about a real personal transformation, and they talk about their disillusionment and departure in equally emotional terms. And in trying to get to grips with that, I've been drawing on a sociologist called Alberoni's book on movement and institution, and his way of trying to understand the effective process of group formation by looking at how participation itself engenders new forms of collective identity. And he has this particular theory of the nascent state, which I'm not going to go into because I don't have much time, but what he talks about as a nascent state is a moment when there's a failure or a crisis in social solidarity of some kind, or a rupture. And he talks about collective formations that emerge out of crisis as transforming what seems existent, just there, real, into something contingent. It could be otherwise. And he says that he argues that those who participate in groups, what they do together is engage in a radical historicization of their past. They rewrite their biographies together, and then they see that everything that they thought was just that could actually be otherwise. And it's this process of search, this historicization and this mutual search for new meanings for the past provides solidarity, searching, reappraising the past together in a group makes possible a future reality at once mine, the others, and ours. And so he makes two very crucial points which are important for me. One is that groups impart a new epistemology, a radical turning of perspective. And to those inside, those outside seem very misguided, trapped, and unenlightened. And it's because it's belonging to the group that provides a new way of seeing. The only way for those outside to really understand is to join us. Intelligibility is through participation. And these groups are held together by a mutual recognition of affinity. And and new ways of reevaluating the world. And it's that which bestows a sense of membership and rebirth, rather than necessarily a common sociological background. It's what happens to you when you go through movements together. Secondly, Alberoni suggests that the group formation straddles a fundamental ethical dilemma. Because when you fracture from larger society, realignment fundamentally demands that each participant choose the solidarity of the movement over another love object. And the other order, even if it's heavily repressive, is also effective. It's a choice between two love objects, such as between the family and the movement, which generate inimical responsibilities and duties. So those who enter through transgression. Their promise of rebirth comes with the betrayal of another love. And this emphasis on love, guilt, and renunciation was critical to the juxtaposition that many militants posed between the idealized gendered kinship of Jaffna Tamil homes and the kinship systems they entered into the militant movements. And this very clear separation of the household and the camp as different ways of loyalty was really emphasized by the movement. So most young men, when they joined the movements, they would go to India probably the next day. They would never tell their families. The majority of the ones I interviewed never told their families that they were going, and they would not see their families for a minimum a year, sometimes for more years. Their families would find out after they had disappeared that they had gone. And so Rajan's story is very typical of this. So he grew up in the borderlands of Anuradhapura, speaking and studying Sinhalese. But then after the 1977 anti-Tamil riots, his family fled up to the north. And as a 14-year-old, he joined the LTTE, and he became a very, very high-ranking sea tiger. Now, Rajan always, he recognized that he liked to be a soldier. So he told me, well, maybe I would have joined the army, actually, if I had stayed there. He said, it's because of racism that I learned to speak Tamil and I joined the LTTE, not the army. But when he joined the LTT, he had to do the obligatory year without seeing his family. And then he told me, I heard my mother was going around crying and looking for me. The movement would not let me go, of course. And like everybody else in the LTT, he now had to wear the cyanide capsule. No other movement did that, but the LTT did it. And he had to have his loyalties towards the movement and the leader, not to his family. So he told me, when I went home, I was wearing a cyanide capsule. I had become part of the movement. I had landed in the movement, now I had to carry on. I had gone to fight, I learned to fight, so I fought. And the capsule, he talked about the capsule that made him a stranger at home. And it's very peculiar in Tamil. So when he talks about going out of the LTT camp, he says in Tamil, he's not that he's returning home, but he says, I'm going outside from the camp. So inside and outside were radically reversed. And it was symbolized by this cyanide capsule, because when he was a cadre, you didn't wear the capsule inside the camp because your life was not your own to take. You only wore it outside the camp because it's in the service of the leader that you're allowed to take your life. So now the second half of this talk is really about the LTT. So I'm not going to talk much about the other militant groups and what happened to them. I'll tell you very briefly that the LTT, all of them started purging themselves internally by the 85, and it was a miasma of violence. But the LTT emerged supreme and it banned the others in 1986. And many of the others entered in with the Indian Army in 1987, but they became inextricably involved with the Indian Army's atrocities because they entered in as a local partners. So basically by 1990, they were finished. Most people who joined had left, many went abroad, most disappeared back into their homes and families that now protected them, and the LTT emerged as the supreme organization and seemingly the only one that fought for Tamils against both the Sinhalese and the Indians. Now, but here I want to talk really about how, and if anyone asks me questions, I can talk about what happened to the other militants that I interviewed. But here I want to move to the LTT and to the two issues that I mentioned at the beginning. Why was the issue, I now realize I only have one issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Why was personal transformation unmatched by societal transformation? And the first kind of answer to this lies in what I've described above. The LTT's more extreme and purified version of popular militancy and the ways in which belonging to the movement bestowed agency and established a dissonance between inside and outside. And I'm going to talk about that more now. And also the second answer, which is that the LTT is the representative movement and its control over life and death. So if you bear with me a little bit, I'm going to read a little bit because this is a bit more complicated. So Giorgio Agamben makes a very useful distinction between an example and an exception. The example is an exclusive inclusion, distinguished from what it belongs to in order to reveal its belonging. So that's the classic anthropological anecdote, right? So I give you this example. It shows a larger reality. The exception is symmetrically opposite. It's an inclusive exclusion. The exception is included in the normal case precisely because it does not belong to it, end quote. It is not that what is excluded no longer pertains. Instead, what is excluded is governed by a withdrawal. The rule applies in willed withdrawal. So if I explain why I think that the LTT is not an example but an exception, Tamil militancy explicitly pitched itself at odds with normative kinship orders, and this is carried to the extreme in the LTT. And there, Tamil militants for the LTT are extraordinary figures who sacrifice themselves and their bodies for Tamils. So, in Palestine, anybody, say, who dies as a result of the Israeli state is called a martyr. But in Sri Lanka, only LTT cadres who die are martyrs, or those associated with the LTT who fast for them. Ordinary people who die are not considered martyrs. So visions of new role and personal transformation were restricted to within the movement, not outside. And rather than reflecting society at large, the LTT created their own purifying boundaries by which bodies and loyalties could be transformed and separated. And so they condensed militancy as a zone of exceptional life. And some of the cultural work of domesticating this exception. So a lot of anthropologists don't write about this, but actually they write about the LTT's symbolism. But the LTT actually set up an office in 1990 to generate symbolism. It's called the Office of Great Heroes. So they actively try to tie themselves into producing hero symbolism and new kind of sacrificial and religious terminal that would explain LTT customs within Tamil tradition, but maintaining the boundaries between the exception and norm, LTT and Tamil society. So I'm going to go further with this, but with two propositions also in line with Agamben, that the LTT constituted its sovereignty over the power over death and its ability to institute a state of exception, hierarchically and ritually separating its cadre from larger society. So I'm not going to go into Agamben in great depth. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about his propositions about sovereignty, which are both in his book on Homo Sacer, which is more about life, and the state of exception, which is more about law. But to put it most briefly, Agamben argues that our modern age is constituted around the constant intrusion of sovereignty, centrally about the production of life as bare life into every corner of modern political governance and law. Sovereignty is that which can decide on life and death. The sovereign is he who can institute a state of exception. This exception, that which is included through being excluded, end quote, is continually constitutive through its very exclusion. So this is actually where Agamben puts the figure of the Homo Sacer, this life which is unsacrificable and killable without retribution, from an occasional figure in Roman law to migrating to the heart of political life. And he does that more in state of exception rather than Homo Sacer, which is talk about the migration of violence to everyday, to a normal, quote unquote, normal forms of authority and governance. So this emphasis on sovereignty as concerned with life and death is of immediate significance in thinking the LTT's claims to sovereignty. But I do want to make a qualification, because I think rather than Agamben's major problem, I think, is that he sees sovereignty as a pre-existing power, or as possibly a coherent occasion. Whereas I'd rather follow Hansen and Steputad in thinking of sovereignty as a potentiality that can be performed. So the sovereign, for me, is not pre-given. The sovereign attempts to become so by instituting states of exception where some lives become killable without retribution. And there's a real possibility of failure. So insurrectionary groups like the LTTE are constantly attempting to institute themselves as sovereign through particular performances and organizations of life and death. And this is where I've written elsewhere about how the LTTE prosecuted Tamil traitors as a way to establish who is the loyal citizen of Tamil Eelam by constantly purging those who were out. And it was a search for unity that had to be constantly maintained. It was a never-ending search. Once you found one traitor, you had to root them out, but then there were always other traitors waiting to be rooted out. But here I'm not going to talk about the traitor, but the other figure who Agamben ignores, but who are also equally important for the institution of sovereignty and whose lives are also killable without retribution. The sacrifice, the loyal soldier and the cadre. And this was the tragedy of the last LTTE battles, is they were willing to recruit thousands and push them into the front of battlefields. So they were expendable lives par excellence. So entry into the LTTE is ritualized through the very promise of death, which is a cyanide capsule. And Tiyaham, the Tamil word which the LTTE describes death in battle and combat, which is often translated as martyr, but actually in Tamil it means abandonment, the voluntary abandonment of life. The Tiyahi is he, she who dies while killing, abandoning life. And actually the LTTE renamed Tatkole, which is suicide, as now Tatkoda, which is gift. That's how they transformed it from Tatkola to Tatkoda. So, and from 1990 onwards, the LTTE weren't allowed to be buried by LTTE cadres who died were not allowed to be given religious or family funerals. They had to be only LTTE funerals, and on their names they were buried instead of cremated. And in fact, they weren't really bodies to bury, but they were given gravestones. And on those gravestones, it was marked their LTTE name and their rank rather than their personal names. And their families were only allowed to come and mourn them on LTTE mourning occasions. The social identity of the dead, as Peter Sharika says, is that of a fighter and not of a brother or a cousin. But most significantly, it is about the fact that the LTTE said that by wearing a capsule, it's not just the suicide squads which were particularly for that, but by wearing a capsule, you pledge that your life was not your own. And that was something that no Tamil group had ever instituted. And it's these two kinds of life and death that were central to the LTTE, the martyr and the traitor. And both of them were killable when held in the zone of exception, but in different ways. And this exceptional separation was most apparent in the LTT's treatment of gender relations. So all the people I interviewed had themselves the same kind of explanation that most scholars have given for why gender relations didn't transform. They said, well, the national question trumped everything else, caste and gender, and everyone said it'll only come after Tamil came, and then people would say, oh, and look, it's all male leadership. But what few pointed out, but is undeniably buried, not just in the LTT, but in all the militant movements, was a horizontal kinship offered by the militant movements never offered a sustainable alternative to the gerontocratic sexualized household, as long as participation was a major force of intelligibility. So Nandini Swarnaraja has pointed out, that's a pseudonym for Nirmala Rajasingam, has pointed out that the celebration of sibling relationships and the distance implied, and the sexual distance that you imply when you call each other brothers and sisters, it sort of masked the interaction between the sexes while trying to attempt a familial cohesion and unity. They couldn't be sexual objects within there. They couldn't have sexualized identities within the movement. And none of the movements ever challenged the strictures of chastity and the role of the wife in Jaffna Tamil society. And the LTT recruited and valorized women on the basis of their membership of the LTT alone and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the nation. So when the LTT always emphasized the celibacy of its cadres, and especially it called its female cadres virgin warriors. And their propaganda talked about them preserving their chastity and expelling their sexual energy on the battlefield. So one very famous poem by Captain Vanadi talks about, I don't wear a thali but a capsule. I don't embrace men but death. So, and this kind of thing appealed much more to conservative Jaffna Tamil society than any of the other groups. And one anecdote is like very telling of this. So at the time of the 2002 ceasefire, LTT cadres were everywhere, but the male cadres generally dressed in civil costume. And the women cadres also dressed in civils, but their civils was very noticeable. They either had short hair or two plaits crossed behind their black long shirts belted over trousers and no earrings. And I asked Sakti, who I interviewed, why are the women cadres so visible in their civils? And she said, and it's very brutal but succinct, she said, well, it's like putting a collar around your dog to show it's yours. And she said, if they weren't marked by being LTT, they wouldn't be given authority in society by others. It's the LTT which forms a skin of power around its female cadre, a skin that has to be marked and made visible as a form of protection and authority. And she told me of how when the LTT cadres had come to arrest the EPLF women in 1986, they told them, what liberation for you? You better get back into the kitchen. Now, so in fact, notions of appropriate womanhood continue to be reproduced in the household despite the arming of female cadres. So it's not just that I'm saying that female cadres from other movements were tortured and killed by the LTT, but the distance between militant women and civilian women was further emphasized. So in 86, leaflets issued by the LTT Women's Wing asked Tamil women to remember the dictates of modesty and to dress in sari and puttu, as the changes which have been taking part in our culture will only demean our society, end quote. Similar leaflets about appropriate dress for non-combatant women were issued in 2002 by the LTT's cultural wing about the necessity to wear sari and look modestly. And so it's actually, Jaffna society has become more conservative in some ways than it was before. I mean, not entirely, but in the visible production of respectable womanhood. So, and at the same time, things are changing dramatically. There's an odd contradiction that you have this society where displacement is becoming ubiquitous, but the emphasis on respectability and modesty is being enforced so heavily by a militant organization where its women are fighting and dying on the battlefield. But the kinds of kinship that the militant movements produce thus ultimately remain parasitic on the sexual kinship of the household, which continue to be reproduced as the appropriate mode for sexual relations. As long as social forms of marriage were not challenged, neither could caste, which is reproduced precisely through the control of household and marriage. And personal transformation was unmatched by societal transformation because it was belonging to the movement alone that licensed new forms of life. And in maintaining a distinction between the exceptional and the ordinary, the militant and Tamil society at large, roles of gender, generation, and caste challenged within the movements were contained and separated from wider society. And this is why the LTT could purge itself of any radical social agenda towards Tamil society, and instead represent itself clearly as a supreme upholder through non-embodiment of the Tamil family, the Tamil nation, and Tamil culture more generally. So this whole muddled, confused muddle of proposed agendas for radical social transformation, Tamil nationalism, the impact of arms and military training that characterized the 80s, which was a very exciting time for many of these middle-aged people then, that they then became, well, they were young then, but then that became very disappointing, and these were all resolved in a sense by the LTT because it disavowed that agenda for social transformation which characterized popular militancy, and then instead concentrated on building vertical ties of Tamil nationalism and the pursuance of land, inheritance, and tradition, and instead the lives and deaths of traitors and martyrs, lives which are sacrificable without retribution, became the central premise around which politics and Tamil life could be produced. So it's here that I want to, if you give me like 2 more minutes, I just want to conclude on here. So let me return to Rajan, the former sea tiger. He tried to leave the movement when he finished. The LTT always said, if you fought for 10 years, you can leave. So he did 10 years of service in the LTT, and he tried to leave also because he fell in love with another sea tiger. And they married eventually, but only after his arrest by the LTT when he was trying to leave, and his imprisonment and torture for 2 years. In London, when I interviewed him and them, they sat together with their 2 children in a rented house, shared with another, whispering their stories to me. Above them towered their landlord's huge picture of Prabhaharan, along with LTT calendars and other paraphernalia. It does remind me sometimes, Rajan said, but I try not to think about it too much. After all, he said, wherever he went in Tamil communities, there they were, meaning the LTT. Once a fearless soldier, after torture, he told me, he could not stand the sight of blood anymore and became easily anxious. However, they had named their eldest son Rajan's movement name, which shows the kind of ambivalence about even when you leave, there's something that you can't just leave behind. The movement haunts you. So, and I myself grew up within a dissident community of men and women who were all ex-militants, but I and all the other children knew them by their movement names. And so it's hard to explain how much these militant movements continue to dominate the everyday lives of those who left them long ago. And these are men and women in their late 40s and 50s. For all the militants that I interviewed, the very idea of movements was foundational, an identity which produces both the togetherness and the depth of disillusionment, abandonment, and betrayal that many feel. It was strongly defined groups that served to nurture their identities and political consciousness. And Kuamurthy reflected a decade on that. The experience of being in these movements marked you in some ineffable way. It's an experience, isn't it? People who are outside, their opinions, their experience was different. Many of them cannot understand. But there is a limit to your understanding once you enter a movement too. People outside could see things clearer. It is these ideas about the movement as the ultimate bestower of agency and identity is what is carried to the extreme in the LTT. And these come out of the histories of these militant groups and a more general legacy of political activism, especially left political activism. In Sri Lanka, where many Tamils and Sinhalese in their 40s are still more likely to identify their youth through groups they affiliated or belonged to. And perhaps it is the elevation of group affiliation, obligation, and loyalty that may have precluded the growth of strong dissent cultures within the movements, only possible when one left. But nonetheless, even after this exceptional life is gone, it prevails for many as a memory that cannot be shared with those outside of the movements, a memory that haunts one's life. If, to return to Alberoni, we can see the process of group formation as an investment in a mutual quest for meaning, investment in a collective love object, the group where meaning and emotion were generated whilst participating, then being alone is more than just being on one's own. Once what is real had been made contingent, return to that real lends hollowness to continuing on a life path that has been revealed to be chosen rather than inevitable. Sakti put it to me very starkly, and she talked about the years after she had left EPRF fully. She said, this life, this is one without any feeling. We have lived here and there, in India, in Colombo, in different houses. So let me end here with this larger generation of people fighting multiple political wars against the state, against their gerontocratic societies, as well as finally against each other. Looking back as they did 20 or 30 years on, for many ex-militants, militancy had transformed them personally, but it hadn't transformed Tamil society in the way that they had intended. What had transformed Tamil society were the provisions of war, upheaval, displacement, death, and disappearance, but not liberation from oppressive caste, gender, or generational structures. Instead, the normative, hierarchical order of the Tamil family became reformulated around the national liberation struggle by the LTTE, producing ultimately conservative national movements and national families side by side. Dowry giving has only gone up in the years of the war, not gone down, for example. It is this history and biographies that I hope will make my point clearer to all of you, also in my critique of some of the fascination with the LTTE. The LTTE, it is a subject worthy of research, but it's also a political organization that acted upon Tamil communities. It didn't just merely emerge from them. And so, its ritualizations and symbolizations were highly reflexive. And within this, I've argued that the question of whether gender transformation has occurred as a result of the arming of women can only be answered not sui generis from the LTT and its self-pronouncements, but more pointed questions about gender transformation for whom and how, and an examination of the gender life cycle that continues to be maintained in Tamil society today. Thank you.